morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started and let people filter in from breakfast. Welcome to the two-part session, or the part one of the two-part session on the core documents. In this session, we're going to cover mission, strategic plan, and code of ethics. And then in the second session, if you would like to stay for that, we're going to cover collections management policies and emergency plans. But let me introduce myself. I'm Julie Hart. I'm the Senior Director for Standards and Excellence at the American Alliance of Museums. And today in this session, we're going to focus on the 5 core documents. These are the documents that I feel are absolutely necessary for every professionally operating museum, and we're going to talk about why you need them. We're going to touch a little bit on the required elements of each and some resources to help you develop them or refine the ones that you have. But what I really want to spend the bulk of the time on this morning is letting you hear from your colleagues and your peers, the panelists that we have today, talking about their experience both developing these documents, working with them, using them in their museum careers, and why they found them so valuable, or on the flip side, what has been the liability of not having them. In the format today is going to be, I'm going to moderate. It's going to be more conversational. I'm not going to have everybody come up and do the little 10 or 15 minute spiel. So we're, just so you know, we're trying to deal with some, the audio setup so we don't have to pass the mics back and forth. So I apologize if there's a little bit of stuff going on or it's a little awkward, because we are recording this session. And I would encourage you, if you have questions throughout, if you want to raise your hand, we'll go ahead and try to take some questions as they go along. And plus, we'll have some time, of course, at the end for questions as you think about those. But let me go ahead and introduce, or have our panelists introduce themselves quickly. And so then we can get started. So and then I'm going to join the panelists over here as we do Q&A. We could start with.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anne McCudden. I'm the Executive Director at the Thomas County Historical Museum in Thomasville, Georgia. Before that, I was the director of the Women's History Park in Miami, which is part of a parks system. So that's a whole other bureaucratic scope that I have. And then before that, I was the director at the Seminole Tribe of Florida's Atotiki Museum in South Florida. And I think I've worked on all of these documents at some point and with a bunch of different governing authorities, so I hope I have some insight to offer.
Good morning. My name's Erin Younger, and it's really great for me to be back here in the Southwest. I'm going to start at the other end of my career. My first job was here in Phoenix at the Hurt Museum a few years back. And then from there I moved back to Washington State, where I'm from, and was at the Burke Museum. I always confuse Burke and Hurt, and all those years I was at either one. I said the other. I was at the Burke Museum for 17 years, and then recently have moved to Washington, D.C., where I am working with the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, which I should note is part of the Smithsonian, not the Library of Congress. And many people yesterday said, oh, why aren't you presenting? And it was, no, that's the Library of Congress and the Folklife Center. But when I was at the Burke, I was the staff lead for our reaccreditation program, and that's when I first got sort of formally focused on both what the content of these documents and also how they were useful to us, and just the process of going through updating our policies was a good thing. So that's why I'm here.
Hi, I'm Art Wolf. I've been involved in accreditation stuff since my first day of work back in the prehistoric era, because that day was a site visit for accreditation for the museum that I was working for then. And since then, I've been privileged to be a director, bringing 3 museums to their first time accreditation and 1 to its subsequent accreditation. And also another one that, after I left, violated its own policies that we had constructed, and they lost their accreditation. So I've kind of seen the good and the bad of what can happen if you don't obey these documents. I did serve on the Accreditation Commission for 6 years. We reviewed over 800 museums in that time. And I've also made multiple visits, site visits to museums that were about to be accredited. And now I help others. 14 years ago, I started my own business. I work with small museums, with tribal museums, and here in Phoenix, a couple years ago, worked with Huhugam Heritage Center on their strategic plan, which I was pleased to see last night. They're very successfully working it. So, thank you.
Thank you. That's obviously, we have a really great, rich depth of experience here represented on the panel. And I should also mention that both Erin and Anne also take part as peer reviewers for our museum assessment and accreditation program. So they go out and have the experience of seeing how other museums are operating and giving their advice as well. So, and both having service on boards, so they can offer some perspective on these documents from a governing body perspective. Erin's on the advisory board at the Burke now, and so that'll come through as we talk later today. So if we look at these 5 documents, you might be wondering, oh, there's a lot of important documents that you should have at your institution, so why is it just these 5 documents? Well, at AAM, we decided to designate the 5 documents on the screen: an educational mission statement, an institutional code of ethics, a strategic institutional plan, collections management policy, and a disaster preparedness or emergency response plan as quote core documents, because we felt that these were the 5 most fundamental for every institution to have to be a professionally operating museum. They embody the core values and practices of museums, and they're really the key ones that are going to, on the most fundamental and strategic level, going to guide your decisions and help you make thoughtful, strategic, and consistent decisions that are going to promote your institutional stability, your institutional viability, and all of them are important risk management tools, not just the emergency plan that you might associate with risk management because it has that term in it. These are all actually very important documents in terms of your overall institution health and well-being and risk management. So you have a handout. If you don't have some, they're on the back credenza. There is a list. One of the documents has the required elements, and each one of these documents has a set of required elements. Those are the minimum things that should be in your document. Of course, every institution is going to sort of manifest those required elements in a slightly different way. So we're going to go through, kind of as we talk today, let those come out, and I'll have them on the slides as well. And Art did mention that in his time on the commission, seeing over 800 institutions come through. At AAM, I oversee the accreditation program and the museum assessment program and a number of other excellence programs that we have there. And that's where these came out of. We didn't just sort of arbitrarily make them up, that these were the 5 that we found that were the most important for institutions to have, and the institutions that didn't have them were the ones that were struggling the most. And these are the 5 that often came up over and over and over in problematic areas when we were reviewing museums for accreditation, or that the peer reviewers were seeing when they were out on site doing their museum assessment visits. So we think it's critical for every museum to have these, whether you go for accreditation or not. These are really fundamental for you. So before I get to the actual Q&A, I'd like to see a show of hands. And once you get your hand up, I want you to keep it up. How many of you have at least one of these documents in some fashion or other? Excellent. How about 2 of them? All right, 3. Keep your hands up if you've already raised your hand, keep your hand up. Who has 3? Up to 3. 4. 5. Anybody have all 5? Couple. Excellent. All right, so that gives the panel a little bit of background in terms of where you are in these documents. Any questions before I get started launching some questions to the panelists? No, we're good to go. Okay. So mission though is, I want to just talk sort of generally about policies and process. I actually have a slide here of the document life cycle, sort of the process of creating any document, whichever core document it is. And one of the things about documents is you can do them, you can develop them, but once you do that, that's not the end. It keeps going. These have to be living documents, and there's lots of people involved, etc. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process. So maybe let's start with you, Erin. What's the value of these particular 5 documents, in your opinion?
Well,
Like juggling drinks all day.
my goal is to not knock over the water. I guess the main thing I would want to say here is that, these 5 do cover a pretty full range of museum operations and really what you need. And I would say as tools for yourselves and for your institutions to responsibly move forward and cover your bases. And they're very interrelated. And I've come to understand this in part being on staff working on reaccreditation. There were certain policies our museum didn't have or they weren't updated. And there's often a collective groan. It's hard work. It takes time to do these things. But once they're done, and frankly the whole process of going through it is actually very useful and becomes quite fun and energizing. And so I've, oddly enough, as far as my own perspective, is become quite a fan of the utility of reviewing these documents from time to time. But I think the beauty of the 5 here is that they really do tie together and sort of create a fabric that is, it helps you be responsible, it helps you get your work done, it helps you when staff come and when they go. There's always that steady thing you can refer back to, your mission, what you're doing and why and for whom, how you're doing it through your strategic plan. The collections really as a central resource. How do you responsibly take care of it? And then, of course, take care of it and take care of the people who come to your museum. So that's
Thank
my
you.
view.
I think that's a great allusion too, that they all weave together. This really is sort of your safety net at your institution. Hart, let me ask you when, and Erin sort of brought this up, this takes time. Creating these processes and policies takes time. They involve a lot of people. And so what are some of the common elements of success when going through the process of creating these? And how do you find the time to, sort of work that into your day job, into creating these policies and procedures and not let them fall to the bottom of the
Well, anyone who ever worked with me can say that I'm pretty hard-assed about that. It's not an interruption of your job. It is part of your job in an institution to work with your colleagues to make the whole thing better. And particularly letting your mission and your vision drive what you do. It brings people together. It depends on where your institution is. Are you just starting out? Are you working for a founder who hand-picked all of you on the staff? Have you been around for 100 years and you had generational turnover and you don't all know each other? Forming these policies can be a great way to bring everybody on the same page, and again make sure that that you're operating professionally and that you're leaving nothing undone, or at least nothing uncontemplated. You may not face some of the issues that come up policy-wise, but if you have them prepared ahead of time, at least you can address them. So it is your job, and you also, I think, on the reviewing the standards and getting feedback is so important, because as you get new board members, as you get new staff members, they need to be brought up to speed on what's expected in your organization, and the policy statements make a good starting point for orientation. And that way, you're not going to forget your own policies, you're not going to let things slide, you're going to keep them evergreen.
Does anybody have anything else else you want to jump in sort of about process and integrating these into your day-to-day work?
I'll try without the microphone. If you guys can hear me, then I'll do it that way. I just want to reiterate what Art said, that it's what you should be doing anyway. So for people to take have the view that, that this is an additional thing, I think is erroneous. I know it's hard to see it that way sometimes, but as you write, let's say, a collection management policy and then implement it and then train people on it and then review it and evaluate it, it sounds sort of cumbersome, but really as you're doing that, you're just actually doing all the collection management stuff you should be doing anyway, which is, looking at what you take in, looking at what you deaccession, looking about how you handle loans, looking at how you deal with donors. So it is really infused in all your daily work. You just kind of don't know it, and when it's perceived as just the policy in the document, it doesn't come off that way. So I know policy is just not the most exciting thing. People don't yay, let's write a policy, but
Speak for yourself.
No, I do love it, but that's why we're up here, and I think that it needs to become, it will become ingrained, and you'll realize that it's stuff I think sometimes afterwards people realize it's stuff they had been doing already, and now you're just codifying it and putting it in a physical document that you can refer back to and have as part of your institutional memory.
Right. I think it makes your life a lot easier once you have these to go back to refer to all the time. You're not reinventing the decision-making process, and you're making consistent decisions. Indeed, and we can just jump right up to that, and I will say that there are a number of policies, different organizations, like for example, AAM has sample documents to certain levels of museum members. Other organizations you may belong to have samples, and I encourage you to use them, but with caution, and we'll talk a little bit later about the tailoring aspect of those.
And
Yeah.
ASLH, American Association for State and Local History, also puts out technical leaflets in their, monthly or quarterly newsletter. And it's a little pull-out section, and it just a lot of times is often about a particular policy.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's great. Yeah, it's great to start with the template and to get ideas and pull things in, but you've really got to take the time. You don't want to shortcut any of the process. I think that's critical to not take the time to think through at your institution what part of that is relevant to you and come with a very customized, tailored code.
Right. It's so easy to cut and paste these days, but you don't want to do that without talking about the policies, because some of them might be so generic that they're not useful. Some might be so specific that they don't pertain to what you actually do. So you can get a good start for the feel of it, but then you have to do your own.
Well, and I'll just add a really practical note, because I'm a really practical person, and a lot of time when you hear all this and then you go home and go, well, but how am I really going to get this started? And in several experiences I've had, I think, doing this really calls out for a champion. If there's someone on your staff, maybe it's a collection manager, maybe it's a volunteer coordinator or the director, whomever it is, if there is a champion, that person can integrate this work and the review of it in various ways. I think the easiest way is to attach reviews maybe to a regular meeting. It's a weekly meeting of staff. Just have that as a check-in time, or have it as a time to make a little assignment. You guys work on this, come back maybe for the monthly staff meeting, review it. But if you can tag it to something you already do, have it become an agenda item, and frankly empower the person who's excited about it to follow through. Part of what at least I'll keep saying over and over again, it's really important to cross over all the different organizational lines, and that's one way to do it, is to empower the person who's enthusiastic about it and then bring the rest along.
I think we'll talk later maybe about governance issues, but ultimately a lot will be generated by the staff, but it's eventually the director has to make it part of their education portfolio for the governing body, whether it's a board or a tribal council or whatever, because those are the people that are going to approve those policies that you may have developed. And so you'll need to convince your director why they're important, and he or she will need to have a a real understanding with the governing body about why it's important. So, it's a back and forth educational process in all that. And the other thing, particularly if you have a large institution and maybe a university museum where you have a bunch of different specialties, almost all the specialties now have their own codes of ethics. And so, what do the botanists, what do the bug people think about this aspect? Or, what if you run a train? What do the railroad people say? So there's a lot more parts than just a standard generic historic / art museum approach, and you need, the bigger you are, the more sensitive you have to be to that.
Great. And I think part of this too is to make living documents. You have to have ownership in them, and involving everybody in the process at some point gives them a stake in it too and helps them understand it. Do you have any of you have any suggestions? If you don't have any of these, where might you want to start first?
I think it depends on what your institution's focus is. I don't mean like art versus history, but are you a heavy collecting institution? Do you have a large collection and the collection plays a big role? I mean, I lean towards the collection management policy, but that's a little bit just me. But I mean, I feel like the mission is probably
first.
where it should start. But I also wonder, people a lot of times don't just, I've gone in institutions where they've had, I had one where all they had was a collection management policy and nothing else. So you'll inherit it in different spots too. But the mission does seem to sort of, everything should kind of come down from there.
I want to expose a weakness. There needs to be a sixth document. I didn't tell you about that, but in my history, there are expectations clearly for almost everything in the accreditation process except interpretation. And since many tribal museums are all about storytelling of a particular culture, my view is that you should probably develop your interpretive approach on the side, since that isn't an official request now, but I hope that someday it will be. So.
Right, you just write that in at the bottom of your handout, number 6. And I think one of the handouts that is on the back table is about, it was written from the perspective of small museums about how to go about developing these documents, and it's a suggested order, but of course, don't let it scare you off. If you don't have any of these, or if you have some, you don't have to do them in a particular order. The idea is just to get going on them. And of course, just so you know, as we talk here today, of course, no judgment or anything for anybody that has them or doesn't have them. The goal is here to give you the sort of tools and information and motivation to go back and work on them. So let's jump to mission statement. We're going to start off with mission statement, the required elements up here on the screen. So Art, can I just start with you and ask you, why is the mission statement so important, and what's its role in relationship to the rest of the core documents?
Yeah, I think that the mission really is the core of what you're doing, and if you're starting out, that's one of the first questions you should ask yourself. I mean, what am I doing here? What are we doing here? What do we want to do? Who do we want to do it for? And why is it of value in the world? And so if you can articulate that, you're very far ahead to begin with. And it's what you want to live. It's like how you want to be. It's not that you're going to be nice to each other. It's not the values type thing, but it's an expression of your good to society. And whether you measure that as a whole or whether you measure it to your tribe or your community, that's what it's about. And we're going to talk later about visions, and there's a difference because the mission is who you are and how you want to live and who you live it for. Your vision is what you want to become. Your vision is not about being, but about becoming. And I just make that distinction to start. And most important to me, and that's something that probably your tribal council had to agree on to a certain extent when they authorized your existence, that there was a purpose for what you're doing. And you can take that. In my own experience, successful organizations make that the center of their world, and then they build everything out concentric circles from that. It's the big rock you drop in the pond and the ripples go from there.
Definitely, mission is everything you're doing is an extension of your mission. So, does anybody want to chime in about what you think some of the good qualities of the mission statement are, or what makes a bad mission statement in your perspective?
We just rewrote ours at the Thomas County, we started there about a year ago, and there had been a variety of them in the past that have been called statements of purpose, and called mission statements, they've been called all kinds of things. There's anything particularly wrong with any of them, although they haven't been updated, but I guess what I, and I haven't recited it, so I can't recite it for you this morning, but anyway, but we ended up with a nice, good new mission statement, and I was kind of excited because we got away from stating the obvious. Like all the previous ones have been very standard, collect, protect, preserve, we're here to, make sure, things are here for the future, which is, there's nothing wrong with that, but I wanted us to get a little out of the box and sort of state, like I think people already know that we collect things, and that we preserve them, and so I got him to talk a little bit more about this thread of stories that's gone through the community for 150 years, and I'm very happy with everybody's very happy with the mission statement, but it took a little effort to get everybody to sort of step away from a little cookie cutter mission statement thing, and I mean, I think it's fine if it's a good guidance tool at first, but I wanted them to sort of state the not so obvious about what you do, because I also think it's a chance for you to really show your uniqueness and show that, what it is that you do is different from what I do in my museum, in terms of generally which comes down to is the interpretation and the content. So step out of that box and state the unobvious, which was hard for people to do. I mean, they were really like, shouldn't we tell everybody we collect them? I was like, well, so it worked out well.
Well, and another way to say that, I think, too, and it's been helpful to my own thinking, is if you think of, the mission statement, because some are just so lofty and aspirational that you want to do everything for everyone all at the same time or something. And we've all seen those, and they do inspire, but again, I bring it down to pretty basic level, but sort of what the museum does, your purpose, whom it serves, that's your audiences, your community, and why. And I think it's the why part that has been more than a more recent effort. It's just like, to what end are you doing these things? What you hope to achieve, what your educational mission is. Not too specifically, but enough that you actually help distinguish yourself from the museum next door or down the road, not in a competitive way, but just in an essential way. This is, our place, this is why we exist, this is what we do, and this is the reason. So.
And I just made up a short mission statement. I mean, some museums are trying to get them so small they can fit on the back of your business card, so that as you present it to someone, you can read your mission statement. I mean, for example, we're here so that everyone knows who we are, where we came from, and what we hope to be in the future. I mean, that's like about as simple as you could make it in your museum. I would distinguish that from the advertising people. The tagline is big now, like the Field Museum, bringing the world to you. Well, that means everything and nothing at the same time. So you want to really think about why, as you said, why you're doing what you do.
And I would say that one of the things that I see in my work that's most left out of mission statements is the who you're serving, which Erin mentioned. Who's benefiting from your service, and so that seems to be a missing piece. So, Anne, you mentioned that you recently revised your mission statement. Was there a particular trigger for that? Were you doing strategic planning or anything like that?
We are. We actually have a meeting in a couple weeks. When I came on board in February, previous director had been there for 23 years, and prior to that, and the place has been open since like 52. Prior to that, I think it had been one other person. So there's, some good work been done, but there had kind of been like these major chunks of management. Nobody had done anything wrong, nothing bad, just a change. And so we did not have, they had done a lot of work with fabulous consultants, not these two folks, but other people, and they'd done a lot of steps towards a strategic plan and towards a mission, but they'd never actually written it. They'd never actually finalized it. And so I did take about 6 or 8 months before I got there. I didn't do it the minute I walked in the door, but I did wait a little while, and we're small, we only have a staff of 5, but I did include the staff and all the board, and I think the impetus was, now I wanted to do it about 6 or 8 months before we started working on our strategic plan, so we could really get used to the mission statement, everybody's on board with it, buy into it, and we've already started doing it. Now we start using it. We do use it in a little bit in a marketing way, but it's starting to ingrain it. Then I think when we go down the strategic planning process, we have something to work from. So it's not just starting from scratch.
Buried deeply in all the expectations of the accreditation program is a statement that says, these are things you should think about, but each of you is different, and as long as you're thinking about and addressing some of this stuff, then that's your business. So I think your points are well taken, but they're not disregarded up front here. And no one actually has to ever apply for accreditation if they can use bits and pieces of this to benefit their own group. So, I wouldn't take this as an oppressive stance that excludes anybody. I would say it's given an opening for people who want to share and learn and then go and have those conversations in community. If you want an example, you should contact the Hugum Heritage Center, which just did a strategic plan a couple of years ago, and involving many community meetings online and written surveys of the community, conversations with elders, the whole process, and they came up with something that is guiding them towards, part of the pride and the inclusion that you saw last night at the event. So there are good examples in the tribal community. I'd be interested to know from Anne, who led her museum, one of the first tribal museums to be accredited. Why did your group decide to do that?
Well, first off, the description that you guys just gave of how you came about to that, that's exactly what we're talking about. So the key thing here, I think, today is the process.
It's the process, and I guess it's the infrastructure, the required elements of what are the components, which then you, as I said at the beginning, will manifest themselves differently at every institution. So we want to give you the framework to work from and then build it to meet your own.
And to answer your question, the executive director above me and below the tribal council, who was in charge at the time, was a firm believer in what you said, the validation, the external validation process from whether it was tribal or non-tribal communities, whatever, across nationally, regionally, et cetera. So she happened to come from a law enforcement background, so she had sort of that mentality of just sort of, having your documents and things in a row. But I tell you, the 4 to 5 year, not to make it sound too daunting, but the 4 to 5 years that it took us to go through it, where we wrote a mission statement, and by we, I'm non-tribal, but I was part of the process. Obviously, a lot of our staff and everybody else that was involved from the tribal community had they had the majority of the input, obviously, but tribal council from the start wanted to do the process, and it wasn't, I can't tell you individually why they wanted to do it, and I was happy that they did, but it was a truly introspective, humbling experience for the staff and the tribal members and everybody along the way to look at their mission statement, figure out are we here as a tourist thing, or are we here for the tribal members? And so all the same discussions took place, and I think that they got out of it. I'm sorry, I can't say we after 12 years, but what they got out of it and what the museum got out of it was the same internal validation about their tribal beliefs and cultures that they also could use for the outside world. So I think they found it. And then there's just the professional, just making sure your ducks are in a row and the papers are where they're supposed to be and the checks are being signed by the right people and all that sort of stuff.
Well, what I was going to do is just jump to instead of do code of ethics next, I want to do strategic plan because we've kind of flirted with that, and just then we'll come back to code of ethics. But could I have, and part of this is, and what I want to tie this to is a lot of the community engagement and the development of the strategic plan, which we'll talk about. But on the whole, does anybody want to talk about why you think a strategic plan is so important? We've talked about it a little bit already, but.
It's the roadmap, to me, it's the guiding document that helps you see 5, 7, however many years that you choose to make it. I know I used it at Atatiki when we didn't have anything prior to that. So we had some mission statements and things. We did not have a long-range strategic plan. And I used it a lot the staff used it a lot throughout the tribal community, even though there was 3,500 tribal members, but they were spread across like the whole southern half of Florida, so we didn't interact with them too much on everybody on a daily basis. But we used it a lot after it was written and agreed upon as a way to explain to the tribal members who weren't able to get to the events and the facilities how we thought the museum was, how it would be important for them to participate and stuff. And it was, I hate to say marketing, but it was kind of as a tool for us to do outreach into the community, explain to of course, the tribal members are the ones that did it. They're the ones that went out into the communities, but we used it as a way to interact with them because some of them lived hundreds of miles away and didn't get there very often. So.
Right. I think one of you mentioned at the beginning that your mission is sort of what you do and why you exist, and your plan is your tool to how are you going to fulfill that vision and mission that you have. So.
Well, the one thing I would add to the discussion right now is that a strategic plan really can help prioritize, what to do this year and what to do next year. It can be really, especially when you're doing the planning, like all the things you want to do or need to do to implement your vision. You might end up with 10 or 20 things on that list, and then if you're faced with trying to do all those this year, it can become somewhat paralyzing. So I've seen it work where through the review process you end up collectively saying, okay, all these things are really important, but these are the top priorities for where we're trying to get. And then that can help you decide what to do in your work plans. That can help you prioritize how to spend your either vast or not so vast resources and just move on and measure how you're doing. And that sounds all kind of technical, but I think most museums and organizations just it's hard to do everything all at once. So I think it's a useful
You don't have
tool.
to either. You've got the rest of your museum's life to do everything.
Yeah.
In my experience, the plans that are written by the director never work because he or she didn't ask anybody else about it. And I think the big change in the last decade particularly, you hear the term community engagement all the time now. And it's really true. And that means, in your context, in the tribal context, it may mean that you really need to be working with not only the official tribal government, but the unofficial clan relationships and the traditional religious people, and as well as just regular tribal members, as well as your neighbors. Depending on where you live, it might be the neighboring town. There's just so many people who, by engaging them, you're going to attract them to your mission and your idea, and you're going to enlist their support in ways you probably didn't imagine would come forward just by having those conversations. And there's all kinds of tools now. People use focus groups, they use surveys, they have town hall meetings, that sort of thing. And I worked with one group where we had many community meetings where the museum committee was floating ideas and bouncing things off of all kinds of tribal members, and it made it much more rich and much more meaningful to the community when it was done. And there's different ways of planning. I'm on an advisory council for a new national monument in Las Vegas, and I'd never worked with Park Service planning before. And they have kind of a different approach from what I'm going to suggest works, which is the planning will lead us to where we're going to go. And if you don't, in my view, if you don't step back and really think broadly, then you're going to be stymied on an annual basis. If funding falls off, or if you stub your toe here and there, then you might have a real roadblock. But if you generally know where you're going, then you can take a detour, or you can get in the fast lane, or whatever. And that's been successful for lots of people. Not just, and by the way, are there 17,000 museums or 35,000 museums?
31 or 35.
And they're not all generic. And so I don't think it's fair to say tribal museums are totally unique and everybody else is the same, because they're all different. They come from different views of founders, or probably the worst reason to create a museum was in the last 20 years, well, the next town has one, so we need to build one. That was a wrong approach, and those are going out of business. The celebrity museums aren't doing well, but the community-based museums are doing better. But I can't imagine who they all are. 35,000.
Right. Well, I think bringing that to life too is one of the required elements of this third bullet that says big picture vision plus implementation, kind of the how, when, who, and resources. It is really critical that whatever your plan is, I mean, that's your decision about what your priorities and strategies are, but it's really important to have both sides of it. The big picture vision of where you want to go, where you're going to be at the end of this plan, but also the specifics of how you're going to get there, because otherwise it does just wind up a nice thing on the shelf without the mile markers to help you actually get to the end result. And I think that's a major piece that some institutions are really good at having one side or the other and not both. So you've got to bring them both together and make sure that they're aligned. And I think the resources piece is one that tends to be the least thought through in the plans that we see in my work. And I think it's really critical for you to remember it's not just how much things will cost in the plan, but if your plan sets out a vision for transforming your organization or doing something big or something very different, how are you building in action steps to generate the resources that you're going to need to be able to do it? Otherwise, you have a plan that's a really great to-do list or a really great vision that's really not executable. So, and Art, you want to just take a few minutes to talk about this Emma concept, which kind of ties the big picture and the action steps together?
I want to introduce you to a lady named Emma. And think about it this way. If you're at the bottom of a mountain and looking up, you can't always see the path. You don't know where you're going to run out of trail. If you're standing at the top of the mountain looking down, you can possibly see a clearer path, or where you need to avoid something, or where you need to go around. And a colleague of mine, Will Phillips, is a consultant to a number of industries, and he thought this up initially, and we've been elaborating it with institutions. But if you think about what are your ends, what are your means that you need, how are you going to measure it, and what actions do you take? If you're starting with the mission and vision, you don't change those very often, maybe only every 5 or 10 years. And then how you're going to get to the mission, you might change, at the end of a 5-year plan or in the middle of one. But then every year you want to know what you're going to be doing, what are the big accomplishments year by year. And then where it really comes together is at the bottom between annual action plans and the process that you use. And what I call it, what you talked about was how, who, why, when. I call that finishing your sentences. In other words, you might have an objective to do this, okay? Who's going to do it? Who's responsible for that? How will you know if they did it? When do you think they should be doing it in the context of everything else? And finally, how much is it going to cost, and do you spend time or money or both on that? And if you think of it that way, and I've worked in private nonprofits and state museums and university museums, and I have to say that the bureaucratic approach tends to be from the bottom, looking up at the uncertain mountain path. Private nonprofits, tribal museums have the opportunity to look from the mountains down and make their plans accordingly. And then you get to the bottom, and milestones are very interesting, because you might say, for the next 5 years, these are the 2 or 3 things each year that we want to accomplish. But if you have an annual review, and very realistically you can come into your board and say, we're just not going to get to that year 2 milestone. We'd like to move that to 3, but there's something in year 4 that we've got a funding source for, so let's do that next year. And so you can play it, you're playing chess and not checkers at that point. again, you can modify that to your own situation, but it's just a matter of always keeping the end in mind as you do something on an annual basis. And then you can be very flexible. If you have a disaster, if you have an opportunity, if you have the ability to expand your staff suddenly, or if you need to build your staff slowly, you can do that looking that way. So that's one way to look at the world. And it seems to be working for a lot of institutions. And they might not call it this, they might not describe it that way, but that's what they're doing is looking long term and not changing their mission every year or just being distracted by shiny objects. You know, if there's an opportunity to do something that it doesn't meet the mission, they don't do it because it's not on there.
Right. And I think, that's a good point is your plan is there to help everybody get on the same page at the organization about where you're going and what you want to do, but it should be, needs to be flexible so you can take advantage of changing external environment as needed. And before I lose the thread, what I was going to talk about before is just a wrap-up comments on the strategic plan about any other notes on involving the community in the planning process, because it's really easy to do it, to get all the staff and the leadership or the board or the tribal council together and work on it. It's much harder to then start pulling in voices that are not at the staff and working in the museum. So,
I mean, we definitely, it was a back and forth. At some point, as you said, you need a cheerleader or an advocate. It's got to start with, either a staff person, but whoever it starts with, I think it's kind of minimal involvement from there. From there, it was just, for us, it was constant back and forth between going out to the tribal communities, which, by the way, there were 6 of them, and they were very distinct in and of themselves. I mean, there were 2 different languages, and there were different goals, so that was challenging. It was almost like, 6 different tribal groups in a way, although it was one federally recognized tribes. But it was a constant back and forth. Go out, get comments, come back, tweak them, talk with the staff, talk with the the governing authorities, go back out, come back in, come back. It was I don't think it was, I guess maybe you could look at it as a continuum, but it was a lot of back and forth with the staff doing the wordsmithing and the consolidating of the comments and stuff, but it was never like, just go out, get comments, summarize them, come back. I mean, there was probably dozens of back and forths over, I don't know, a year or so that took us to write our strategic plan. Including all the stops when you're eating lunch and somebody pulls you aside and then gives you a comment, or you're getting gas at the gas station on the way home and a travel member comes up, and same thing in any community. I mean, I get that now in Southwest Georgia. I go to get gas and somebody says, oh, you're at the museum, let me tell you something. So that's exactly the same, and I have to take that comment with the same amount of respect, write it down, log it in my head, whatever it is, as I would have in the tribal community, understanding that the 22,000 people who live in Thomasville are like a 22,000 person tribe, and they really are in Southwest Georgia, let me tell you. And it's the same amount of, I take that back, bring it back to the staff, bring it back. It's just a constant back and forth, and it's never done.
just so we have a quick time to talk about the code of ethics. It is another core document. It's very important. It's kind of the values of your organization. The what and the whys and your mission statement, your plans, how. This is really about your institutional values. And it's very important. This is the time you can really be very self-reflective and think about what's important to your museum in terms of your values, your principles, and putting them down on a piece of paper. And I have 2 questions for our panelists. One of them is that you've all had some recent, or Erin and Anne, I should say, you've had some recent experience developing codes of ethics. Could you just talk a little bit about the process behind it and some of the things that came up as you're developing this code that's going to help shape your decisions and guide the thinking and the behavior of the organization in terms of its accountability to its community and to yourselves within the organization?
Go ahead. Sure. So I'm working on one now at my current institution, but I'll refer back to the tribal museum that I worked at for the one we wrote there. And as Julie said, it's the sort of the framework for how you're going to operate ethically, morally, etc. But it does have some mechanical components to it, if you will, in terms of complying with laws. So I know at Atatiki we had to we had to sort of include in there, you know, we're going to comply with federal laws, being a, you know, tribal government, although sometimes tribal museums are set up as private 501c3s, and they're not actually a branch of the government, so they might have a slightly different, you know, different rules might apply. So the law part was a little tricky, and I think it's also important, the Code of Ethics is where we really delved into the various advisory boards and advisory groups that one of which we formed and some of which were already there in the tribal community that we were going to use as partners. So this was our document where we mentioned how are we going to interact with the seniors, how are we going to interact with the school groups, how are we going to interact with our own museum advisory tribal council that we had, and sort of talk about all the different groups that have a cultural interest in the museum. And it went beyond just the Seminole tribal members in the state of Florida. We also sort of delved into, if I recall correctly, sort of larger, almost 5 or 6 ancestral homeland area of the southeastern United States that pertain to the Seminole people, you know, delving into the Creek and the Appalachia and everything, and prehistoric folks, et cetera. So we kind of got broad in that sense too, in explaining that those people had buy-in into the cultural information, and that how we should allow them to be part, or not allow, but, you know, include them as part of the process and how we operate ethically. But of course it has, you know, we also mentioned things about confidentiality and political activity and some of the day-to-day nuts and bolts of a code of ethics, but there was definitely a component about cultural groups, tribal groups within the tribe, and tribal groups in sort of the southeastern United States. And it might differ from different parts of the country, but that was relevant in South Florida.
You know, the thing to keep in mind, this is evolving in all kinds of contexts, and you know, including where you read that a university wants to sell all the museum collections to build their endowment to support students. I mean, you see all kinds of ethical questions coming up. And one of the things, I was on the AAM board when we struggled for years to create the AAM Code of Ethics because no one could agree. And it's, you know, it's coming down to if you know yourself, if you know how you operate in the world, and you define that, and then you stick to that, you're being ethical. You know, the interference would be if there's a federal law involved, or, you know, something that you have to comply with. In the repatriation summit on Sunday, how many of you were in that one on Sunday? Okay, you were there. The conversation there ethically for all museums is moving away from treating NAGPRA simply as a matter of property rights to treating those kinds of laws as a matter of human rights. And so I think you'll see more human rights statements coming into ethics codes wherever they might be written. So the world is evolving, and you know, it used to be about, do you have a conflict of interest? You know, does your board member want to run your gift shop for you and make money off of you while they're still a board member? I mean, you know, that's how it used to be. Is there a conflict of interest, and should that be declared in a board meeting? I have to not vote on this because my cousin is involved in that. I mean, that's how it started, a lot of it. But now it's going to give you an opportunity to make a statement about how your tribe is positioned in the world and how you think about other people as well.
In terms of ethics codes, Art, you mentioned the sort of the NAGPRA discussion. Are there any particular unique ethical issues to museums that are either tribal museums or museums that are holding Native American collections that might need to be in the code of ethics or to look at? Because again, this is about your institution's behavior as a whole and your institution's values and obligations to yourself and others.
You know, you please speak up if you have something going on in your own community. What I'm seeing is that codes of ethics can include exceptions or allowances for collections policies, in the sense that there are many tribes now who maintain collections. They act as safe houses and warehouses for communal property, and so, you know, it's not a doctrine or policy that you can never take something out, or you can never put it into active or consumptive use as it was intended to be traditionally. even though the museum might be caring for those things in between ceremonies or public events. And so, a statement might be included about that sort of thing, that in respect of tradition, perhaps that you'll designate a certain collection that is in use, basically. There may be others. Is anybody doing something different?
I just want to echo how important, the nuance of all this is, and then having it written down. It just becomes such a useful tool. And within tribal communities and tribal museums, there absolutely are issues and topics that may not pertain to the State Museum of whatever in the large city nearby. But that is where you can kind of stake your claim and say, no, this is important, and this is governing us, and this is guiding us. And getting consensus on what exactly that is, I expect is, will take quite a bit of back and forth discussion, but there's nothing like starting. Just write some stuff down that comes from a core understanding and then work through it. Especially in this area, it just seems really critical how you're managing your resources, who gets to decide what, and why, under what circumstances. And if you remember or think ahead that this is a really useful tool, so that when the next person becomes director of the museum, they actually have that guidance, so they, can make an informed decision right off the bat, the first week on the job. So.
Yeah, that's good.
And I do think it's important that your ethics code, it shouldn't be secret. I would encourage you to put it on your website or make it public, because it's a great educational document and a great statement to tell your public, your community, anybody you're engaged with, what your values are, and help them maybe understand things that are unique about you, or unique about how you think and how you work, and how you view your collections, your assets, anything like that. So I think actually all of the documents we talked about today, you should be very transparent about them as well. Not only do you engage the stakeholders who you're serving to be part of developing them, but also then share them back. I think they're great educational tools as well, great decision-making tools, which we've heard a lot about. That's a big challenge. Consistency across staffing numbers and leadership, and that may change and come and go. So does anybody have any sort of wrap-up comments about these documents, their connectivity or resources?
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about the samples before, or anything you want to add as a tie-up?
In the Repatriation Summit, frequently cited was the International Code of Ethics that's going to begin to apply to the trafficking in native artifacts that you read about in Europe. And you can go to icom.museum, and their code of ethics is on there, and the tribal scholars and experts on that panel referred to that frequently as a good resource. You can find it there.
And then one other thing I want to get to is, do you want to comment on the value of accreditation to your organizations?
I mean, I understand what you mean about saying you'd had it as a goal, and now it seems, either, I don't know, irrelevant or unattainable or whatever it is. But I think if you break down what you do to get accredited, in terms of looking at the sections of the self-study, governance, collections, et cetera, and if you just maybe look at those things and have them as individual goals, totally not associated with the accreditation process. You can take that off the table if you want. But for instance, if we looked at the education and interpretation section of the accreditation self-study and the questionnaire, and you start reading those questions, I think it will lead you to think, oh, I need an interpretive plan for my institution. So maybe the end goal is that you write an interpretive plan or a code of ethics or a strategic plan. I guarantee you, years down the line, if you start filling those things in, you'll be, that much closer to accreditation, and the goal, whether or not you still want it, would be that much more obtainable, because that's how it's broken down. I don't remember all the sections, but governance, education, collections, finances, all those types of things. Those are things you're probably looking at anyway. But when you're looking at it as just, your example is you're you're looking at the top of his Emma thing and you're at the bottom and you're seeing accreditation as opposed to, you know, maybe flipping around and all the stuff that you're going to do to get there or would have to do to get there is stuff you should be doing anyway and probably will be doing anyway.
And you don't need to go for it. I think
Yeah.
that's an acceptable option. It depends on where you live. You know, when one of my institutions got accredited, they held a parade down Main Street for us.
Yeah.
You know, it was a community pride thing. And funders sometimes are attracted. If you run a college or a university, you know, they live on their accreditations, you know, for teaching and faculty and all that. So they want one more thing in their quiver, you know, to be accredited. So it's the process. You know, by the time you get accreditation, you've already done all the work.
Yeah.
Right.
And you're already, even if you only go partway there, you're still much better than you were before.
And the only thing I can add, and it's somewhat repetitive, but I think of it, and again, as many have said, it doesn't, to me, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're actually going through the process, but that process, it's like continuing education. You know, there's every 10-year, maybe it's changed process, but when I was at the Burke Museum, which is at the University of Washington, so it's one of these complicated, big, old places, in the 10 years prior, the whole phenomenon of having an integrated code of ethics had come up, and we didn't have one. We had all kinds of codes sprinkled around the university and the different academic departments, but nothing would have pushed us to try to consolidate our thinking except the self-study. And so it actually was really good. We got people to talk about things that, well, we all thought we knew. We had all had our various entrees into the museum world, but if they were 20 years old, you know, some of these new issues that have come up, it just, you know, and you can do that on your own, and, you know, there are many resources out there to support that. But that continuing education aspect of what's going on in the field at large, having to do with access or who owns what or who has the right to do what, that evolves, and it's just a focused way to find out about it.
Besides the MAP programs, other resources, I work with a lot of smaller history museums, and they find that the STEPS program of AASLH is valuable. That's almost like a tutorial, and for any issue, it says here's the best, or like, you know, here's the basic, the better, and the best of how you could do something, and so and it's based on conversation, so you could decide where you wanted to start and where to be. So that's a AASLH